A billionaire's only son was preparing for a life-or-death transplant after months of mysterious treatments in a private hospital, when a new maid, recently hired at the family's mansion, noticed something strange. She wasn't a doctor, she wasn't supposed to ask questions, but what she saw during her night shift made her doubt everything she had been told about the boy's illness, the doctors in charge, and the powerful company behind his care. Within days, her quiet job inside the mansion would turn into a dangerous investigation that no one expected, putting her face to face with secrets that could destroy an empire. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. In the rich neighborhood of Seattle, Richard Ellington, a very powerful businessman, lived in a large and expensive house. He owned Tech Industries, one of the most important technology companies in the country. People respected him, and he had everything a person could ask for: money, success, and a beautiful home. But behind all that, Richard was going through the worst time of his life. His only child, Liam Ellington, who was only 7 years old, had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive type of cancer. The news had changed Richard completely. The man who once controlled business empires with confidence was now scared and confused. He felt helpless, like none of his money could fix what was happening to his son. He could no longer sleep well. His thoughts were always with Liam. Nothing else seemed important anymore. The house felt quiet and heavy. Richard spent most of his time near Liam, trying to stay strong, even when he felt like falling apart inside. Doctors had run many tests to understand Liam's illness. Richard didn't want just any medical opinion. He paid for the best. Private doctors were flown in from different countries. They did exclusive tests that were not available to most people. Richard even contacted European research hospitals and arranged meetings with teams working on experimental treatments. After weeks of stressful waiting, one clinic in Europe offered a possible solution: an experimental transplant. It wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was the only chance. Richard didn't hesitate. He immediately agreed and offered a huge reward, billions of dollars, to anyone who could make it happen. He wasn't worried about the money. He just wanted his son to live. The transplant was risky and needed to be done in a very controlled environment. The doctors suggested a special clinic, but Richard had other plans. He arranged for the procedure to happen at the St. Matthew Hospital, one of the best hospitals in Seattle. A private wing was cleared and prepared for Liam's care and the future surgery. The hospital wing, chosen for Liam, was completely isolated from the rest of the building. No one could enter without special permission. Richard made sure everything was clean, safe, and ready for the medical team that would arrive soon. Only a few trusted nurses and doctors were allowed to take care of Liam. Richard also hired a private security team to keep watch at all times. He didn't want any mistakes. He knew how rare the surgery was, and he couldn't afford anything to go wrong. Meanwhile, Liam stayed in his hospital bed, weak and tired. Sometimes he had energy to smile, especially when Richard brought him toys or read to him. But most of the time, Liam slept. The illness was draining his little body, and Richard hated seeing him like that. He remembered when Liam used to run in the backyard and ask him questions about everything. Now, the boy could barely talk. Richard sat with him every day, holding his hand, hoping for a miracle. Because of the importance of the case and the amount of money involved, the media tried to get information about Liam's health. Journalists stayed near the hospital and tried to contact people who worked for the Ellington family. Richard didn't want the world talking about his son's sickness. He wanted to protect Liam from the public eye, so he went to court and got a legal order to block the media from reporting anything about the case. News agencies were forced to stay away, and no photos or updates were allowed to be shared. Richard also gave strict instructions to everyone working in his house. They were not allowed to talk about Liam or the surgery to anyone, not even their families. Every employee had to sign legal agreements promising to stay quiet. Some of them were scared, but they all agreed. They knew Richard would not forgive anyone who broke the rules. Inside the house, everything had changed. The silence was heavy and no one smiled anymore. Richard had stopped going to work. He left the company in the hands of his most trusted executives and told them not to bother him unless it was truly urgent. He didn't care about meetings, profits, or projects. He only cared about his son now. In the hospital, he followed the progress of every treatment. He called doctors daily, asked questions, and made sure Liam received the best care possible. The doctors warned him that the transplant was very new, still being tested in special clinics, and came with many risks. But Richard didn't care. He had made up his mind. If there was even a small chance that Liam could survive, he would take it. Days passed slowly. Some nights, Richard slept in a chair beside Liam's bed. Other nights, he walked alone through the hospital halls, trying to keep calm. He thought a lot about the past, about when his wife was still alive, and about how happy they were when Liam was born. Now, everything felt uncertain and painful. As preparations for the surgery continued, Richard stayed strong on the outside. But inside, he was terrified. The experimental team from Europe was on its way, and the medical equipment had already arrived at the private hospital wing. Specialists were working day and night to prepare for the transplant. Richard watched everything closely. He wanted to be there for every step. He had promised Liam that he would never leave him, and he meant it. He brought Liam's favorite blanket and a few books to the hospital room. Every little detail mattered. Liam was still very sick, but he trusted his father. He didn't know everything about what was happening, but he knew that his dad was doing everything he could. Richard sat by the window and looked at the quiet streets outside. He wondered how things had changed so fast. Just a few months ago, they were planning a family vacation. Now he was putting all his hopes and his fortune into a single risky surgery, but he had no other choice. Sarah Monroe had been going through a hard time. At 35 years old, she was a single mother and had just lost her job at a hotel chain where she had worked for years as a cleaner. Bills were piling up and she had no savings left. Her rent was late and she was worried about how she would take care of her son. Then, through a friend of a friend, she heard that the Ellington family was looking for someone to help with cleaning. The job came suddenly, and she didn't have time to ask too many questions. She was told to start immediately. The pay was better than usual, and she accepted without thinking twice. Sarah arrived at the Ellington mansion nervous, but determined to do her best. She knew this job could help her stay afloat. The mansion was huge and beautiful, much different from any place she had worked before. She was assigned cleaning duties and told to be quiet, respectful, and to follow orders carefully. From the first day, Sarah worked hard. She arrived on time, followed all instructions, and stayed away from gossip. She didn't ask questions or try to get involved in things that didn't concern her. Her quiet attitude and clean work made a good impression on some of the staff. A few employees started being friendly with her. They said she was different from other new hires, more respectful, more professional, but not everyone liked her. Some older staff members felt uncomfortable with how quickly she adapted. A few were jealous because she got tasks in the main parts of the mansion, places that only trusted workers were usually allowed. Sarah noticed the tension, but she didn't let it affect her. She just focused on her job. Sometimes she would get extra shifts at night, including cleaning at the hospital wing where Liam Ellington was being treated. She didn't know much about the boy, only that he was very sick, and everyone talked about him in hushed tones. One night during one of those hospital cleaning shifts, something unexpected happened. Sarah was assigned to clean one of the patient rooms in the private hospital wing. She followed her checklist like always, moving from room to room carefully. When she walked into the next room, she was surprised to see that a child was awake and sitting up in bed. It was Liam. She had never seen him awake before. Most times his room was closed or guarded, and no one was allowed to enter without permission. But this time, he was alone. He looked at Sarah with tired eyes and whispered, "Mommy," before slowly closing his eyes and falling asleep again. Sarah stood still, not sure what to think. For a moment she thought maybe he had mistaken her for someone else. She felt a mix of sadness and confusion. The child looked weak, and his voice was so soft. She quietly finished her work and left the room, but the moment stayed in her mind. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what happened. The way Liam had looked at her, the way he called her Mommy, it all felt strange. She knew it was probably because he was sick, maybe dreaming or confused. Still, she kept remembering the look in his eyes. She also started to pay more attention to the hospital wing. As she worked, she noticed things she hadn't seen before. Medical papers were sometimes left out on tables instead of being stored away. Some charts had pages missing or were placed in the wrong patient folders. She saw one nurse look nervous when Sarah came near. Another time, she watched a nurse throw away a full package of medicine. The trash bag had several sealed syringes inside. Sarah wasn't a doctor, but she knew enough to realize that something didn't seem right. She didn't say anything to anyone yet. She didn't want to get in trouble. But inside, she knew something strange was happening. Sarah began to work more often at the hospital wing, and with each shift, she saw more things that didn't add up. Some of the staff were very careful, almost too careful, while others seemed rushed or distracted. Once, she found a medical report left near a trash bin. She didn't open it, but the name Liam Ellington was printed on the front. She placed it back on a nearby desk and walked away, but the situation was beginning to bother her. Why were important documents lying around? Why were medications being thrown away? One evening, a nurse seemed startled when Sarah entered the room. The nurse quickly hid something under her coat and left without speaking. Sarah told herself not to get involved, but it was becoming difficult to ignore. The more she saw, the more she wondered what was really happening with Liam. Was he getting the treatment he needed? Was someone hiding information? She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew this wasn't normal behavior in a hospital. Even though Sarah had only been working for a short time, she could feel that something deeper was going on. Liam seemed isolated. Sarah rarely saw anyone visit him besides medical staff. His room was always quiet. No toys, no signs of family, no pictures, just machines and silence. Sarah started doing small things, like tidying up his space with extra care or leaving the curtains open so light could come in during the day. She never told anyone about the night he called her Mommy. She wasn't even sure what it meant, but since that night, she felt a strange connection to him. She still needed the job and couldn't afford to lose it, so she kept quiet, observed, and waited. She didn't know who to trust or if she was imagining things, but deep down, she felt that Liam needed help, maybe more than anyone knew. And even though it wasn't part of her job, Sarah had a growing feeling that she couldn't just walk away from what she was seeing. Sarah tried to ignore her growing sense that something was wrong, but it became harder every day. She told herself that she was only there to clean, that whatever the doctors and nurses were doing was none of her business. But the things she saw didn't make sense. Some medicines were never used, and Liam's treatment seemed too simple for someone with such a serious illness. She often stayed late into the night, mopping the halls or cleaning the patient rooms after the staff left. One night, while taking out the trash, she saw one of the doctors from Liam's medical team standing near a back corridor. He wasn't alone. A man in a suit, someone Sarah didn't recognize, handed him an envelope that looked thick and heavy. She froze, and watched quietly from a distance. The doctor accepted the envelope, looked around nervously, and slipped it inside his coat pocket before walking away quickly. That moment stayed in Sarah's mind all night. She didn't know who the man in the suit was, but his face looked familiar. The next morning, she overheard one of the staff members mention a representative from Elintech who had come to check on Liam's condition. The name made her stomach turn. Why would a company representative be paying a doctor at night in a hospital corridor? The whole situation felt wrong. Sarah tried to tell herself there could be an innocent explanation. Maybe it was just a donation or hospital payment. But deep down, she didn't believe that. The doctor avoided eye contact with her the next day, and that only made her more suspicious. Later, when she went to clean Liam's room, she noticed that the boy was still only receiving clear fluids. The label said, "Vitamin solution," nothing more. The syringes used for stronger medications were sealed, unused, and later thrown into the trash without explanation. Sarah's curiosity started to turn into fear. She wanted to talk to someone she could trust, so she approached one of the nurses who had been kind to her before. Late that night, during her break, Sarah quietly mentioned what she had seen: the money, the strange medicines, and the unused syringes. The nurse's face changed immediately. Her smile disappeared, and she looked around the break room before speaking. She told Sarah to stop asking questions and not to talk about it again. "You don't understand how things work here," she whispered. "If you want to keep your job, stay out of it." Sarah was shocked by her reaction. The warning felt serious, like more than just a suggestion. From that night on, Sarah knew she had to be careful, but she couldn't just forget what she had seen. The images of the envelope, the unused medicine, and the nervous staff members stayed clear in her memory, pushing her to find out what was really happening. After that, Sarah began to act quietly. She started paying more attention to the trash bins in the hospital and even in the Ellington mansion. Every time she found papers or medical documents that looked important, she would take them. Sometimes it was a printed report with strange numbers. Other times it was a copy of a medical chart or a page with the hospital logo. She didn't take everything, only the ones that mentioned Liam's name. Sarah wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she felt she needed proof, something that showed the truth. She began hiding these papers in an envelope inside her bag. When her shift ended, she would go home and spread them out on her small kitchen table. She read each page carefully, trying to understand the medical terms. Some words made no sense to her, but she used her phone to search meanings late into the night, refusing to give up. The more she read, the stranger it got. Some reports seemed too old, printed years before Liam's illness was even diagnosed. One document showed test results dated before the boy was born. Another had a doctor's signature that appeared identical on multiple forms, as if it had been copied and pasted. Sarah frowned at the details. She knew medical files were supposed to be exact, but these looked tampered with. A few papers mentioned medications she had never seen given to Liam. There were also different diagnosis codes that didn't match the ones on his current hospital chart. It was confusing, but she felt certain there was deception somewhere. Each new discovery made her hands shake. She didn't know if she was uncovering something dangerous or if she was simply misunderstanding things. Still, she kept going. Every night after work, she sat with her growing pile of papers, marking dates, names, and numbers with a pen. Sarah began to see a bigger pattern forming. It looked like someone was manipulating information about Liam's treatment. The repeated signatures, missing records, and strange medication lists all pointed to something being covered up. She didn't know why or who was behind it, but she was sure the truth wasn't what people believed. She thought about telling Mr. Ellington, but the idea scared her. He was powerful, and she didn't know if he was part of it or a victim like Liam, so she stayed silent. She carried her envelope everywhere, afraid someone might find it if she left it at home. During the day, she acted normal, cleaning, smiling, following orders, but her mind was always racing. She couldn't shake the image of the doctor taking money or the sealed syringes thrown away. Sarah didn't want trouble, but now she was involved. Whether she liked it or not, she had seen too much to walk away. Sarah finally made a decision. After many nights filled with worry and confusion, she decided to find a lawyer. She didn't want to accuse anyone just yet, but she needed legal advice. She felt unsafe and didn't know who she could trust. After her shift at the mansion, she walked to a nearby office to meet with a small local attorney. They agreed to speak the next day, but as she walked back home, Sarah noticed something strange. Two men were following her. She crossed the street, they crossed too. She slowed down, they slowed too. They didn't speak or come close, but it was enough to scare her. When she finally reached her apartment, her hands were shaking. She locked the door and checked every room. The next morning she left for work, but when she came back in the evening, her front door was open. Someone had broken in. Her things were moved around and her bag of documents had been touched, but nothing was missing. Sarah felt sick. The intruders hadn't stolen anything, not even her old phone or her cash. But they had opened the hidden envelope where she kept the hospital papers. Everything was out of order, as if someone had gone through every sheet and then placed them back in a rush. That confirmed her worst fear. Someone knew what she was doing. She tried to calm down and not panic. The next day, she went to work at the hospital, like nothing had happened. But during her shift, a supervisor called her into the office. She was told she had been reported for inappropriate behavior and warned that another incident would result in her termination. No one explained what she had done. It felt like a warning, a way to silence her. The nurse who had previously warned Sarah to stop asking questions was no longer there. Word spread that she had been fired suddenly. No one talked about it. Everyone acted like it was normal, but Sarah knew it wasn't. Each day that passed, things became more tense. People avoided Sarah, and some staff even stopped speaking to her. The feeling inside the hospital was different now. The friendly environment was gone, replaced by silence and fear. It was like everyone knew something bad was happening but didn't dare say it out loud. Even at the mansion, Sarah noticed changes. Security was tighter. Doors that used to be open were now locked. Conversations ended when she walked by. She felt watched. She tried to continue doing her job as if nothing was wrong, but she couldn't relax. She was always alert, always wondering who was listening. Meanwhile, Richard Ellington seemed even more anxious. He approved another large payment to the foreign clinic. Rumors among the house staff said a surgical room had already been prepared overseas. Richard barely looked at anyone. He was completely focused on Liam's case. He looked like a man with no more hope, making desperate choices with no questions asked. Sarah continued to work in the hospital wing and kept watching closely. Liam still didn't show signs of improvement, but she also didn't see clear signs of serious illness. He seemed tired and pale, but she never saw him cry in pain or show symptoms that matched what she had read in the papers. In fact, the only treatments he received were basic vitamins and fluids. There were no complex procedures, no heavy medications, and no visible preparation for an urgent transplant. Sarah was now fully convinced that something serious was being hidden. She remembered the forged medical records, the fake dates, the identical signatures, and the money-changing hands. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Liam might not be sick at all. Maybe there was no need for a transplant. But why would anyone fake such a thing? Why would someone so rich and powerful go to such extremes? Sarah had no answers, only questions. And she knew that asking them out loud could put her in danger. By now, Sarah had no doubt that she was seen as a threat. To most people in the mansion and hospital, she was just a cleaner. No one believed she had any reason to get involved in such a complex situation. If she said something, they would call her paranoid. If she brought up the papers or the strange behavior of the staff, they would laugh or ignore her. She was alone, completely alone. Even her few friends at work were distant now, afraid of getting in trouble. She felt the pressure closing in from all sides. Her home wasn't safe, her job was in danger, and the more she tried to understand what was happening, the more isolated she became. Still, she kept her copies of the documents hidden again, in a new place. She wrote down every detail she remembered. She wanted to be ready in case something happened to her. She didn't know who was behind everything, but she was sure someone wanted her quiet. Everywhere Sarah went, it felt like someone was watching her. The once simple cleaning shifts now felt like walking through a trap. The people who used to smile at her didn't even make eye contact. Richard never spoke to her, but she could tell he was growing more desperate. He signed whatever documents were placed in front of him and approved every bill from the international clinic. Sarah believed he truly thought Liam was sick. That made the situation even more painful. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell him to look closer, to stop trusting everyone around him. But she couldn't. She was just the cleaner. No one would take her seriously. Even worse, she was now seen as someone with mental problems, a paranoid worker making up stories. No one listened to cleaners. That's how they got away with it. Sarah felt trapped. But she also knew that if she gave up, no one else would try to find out the truth. And that thought kept her going. Sarah was shocked when she received an official notice saying she was under investigation. According to the document, someone had anonymously accused her of illegally accessing private medical records and breaking professional rules. She didn't understand how it had reached that point. Everything happened fast. Police officers arrived at her home early in the morning and took her in for questioning. At the station, she was placed in a small room and questioned for hours. The officers asked how she had obtained certain files, why she had them, and who else knew. Sarah tried to explain that she had only found discarded documents and never meant to break any laws. But the officers didn't seem convinced. She didn't have the documents anymore. They had been stolen or destroyed during the break-in. She had no proof left. After more than 6 hours of questions, they let her go. She wasn't arrested, but they told her she was now being watched closely and should be careful. Returning home, Sarah felt more alone than ever. She looked around her small apartment and realized she no longer felt safe anywhere. Her door had been broken into, her documents were gone, and now she had been publicly accused of a crime. She didn't know who had sent the anonymous tip, but she had a strong feeling it was someone from the hospital or the mansion. The pressure was closing in from every side. That same day, Richard Ellington found out about the investigation. Furious, he called for her immediate termination. He believed she had invaded his family's privacy and could put the entire operation at risk. But during a meeting with his legal team, one of his oldest lawyers stepped in and disagreed. He said firing Sarah right after the accusation could make the media or law enforcement suspicious. People could think she was being silenced. He suggested keeping her employed under certain restrictions to avoid attention. Richard agreed, but reluctantly. Sarah was told she could return to work, but with new rules. She was not allowed near certain areas of the mansion or hospital. Her duties were limited, and her schedule was changed. It felt more like punishment than employment. The other staff avoided her, even more than before. She noticed whispering when she walked into a room and people turning their backs as she passed. Security guards watched her closely. Even the cleaning supplies she used were double-checked before and after her shift. Sarah felt like a prisoner. Still, she returned every day. She needed the income, and deep down, she still hoped she could uncover the full truth about Liam's condition. Her trust in anyone was almost gone. She didn't know if someone would plant more evidence against her, or if she'd be blamed for something else. She followed every rule, stayed quiet, and tried to avoid attention. But the fear of being set up again never left her mind for a second. One night, while working her reduced shift in the hospital wing, Sarah was wiping down equipment when a young man in a white coat approached her. He looked around before speaking and then quietly said her name. She turned, confused and cautious. The man introduced himself as Jason Harper, a resident doctor working under the main medical team. Sarah didn't recognize him at first, but he said he had seen her before and knew what she had been trying to do. He explained that he had accidentally found part of the documents she had hidden weeks ago. He had read just enough to feel something was wrong. He didn't know the whole story, but he believed the test results and files didn't match Liam's real condition. Jason looked nervous as he spoke, but also serious. He told Sarah he wanted to help. He believed her suspicions might be right, but he also warned her to be extremely careful. He said they needed to move quietly and trust no one. Jason asked her not to mention his name to anyone, not even in writing. He said too many people were involved in Liam's case, and some of them had too much power. He'd seen things that didn't make sense, like Liam's treatment plan being updated by doctors who weren't on staff and signed by names he had never met in person. He told her that questioning anything out loud had already made him a target of gossip. Sarah listened carefully, surprised that someone else finally believed her. For the first time in weeks, she felt less alone. But she also knew this didn't mean they were safe. If Jason was caught helping her, he could lose his medical license. Or worse. Sarah agreed to speak only in person, never over the phone or by message. They decided to work together slowly, collecting new information, double-checking records and watching carefully. They didn't know where it would lead, but they knew something was definitely being hidden. That night, as Sarah returned home, her thoughts were racing. She was still under watch, her reputation was damaged, and her documents were gone. She had no solid proof, and most people saw her as someone who had crossed a line. But now, she wasn't completely alone. Jason's words echoed in her mind. Someone from inside the system had seen what she had seen. That gave her a little strength. She started writing everything down again from memory, every date, every name, and every odd thing she had seen in the mansion and hospital. She hid her new notes in a different place. She still didn't know who had betrayed her or who was controlling things behind the scenes, but she was more determined than ever. Sarah returned to work the next evening as quietly as before. No one knew she had met Jason. To the rest of the staff, she was just a paranoid cleaner, one who had been accused and humiliated, and that's exactly how she needed to remain. With Jason's help, Sarah finally got access to Liam's original medical exams. It wasn't easy. Jason had to wait until late at night when most of the hospital staff was gone. He used his credentials to log into the hospital's secure database while Sarah stood watch in the hallway. After entering several passwords and searching through records, he found the files marked under Liam Ellington's name. These were the earliest medical exams, the ones from the beginning of his supposed illness. Jason downloaded everything onto a flash drive and printed copies for them to review. Back in a quiet supply room, they went through the documents one by one. What they saw was shocking. There were no signs of cancer in any of the test results. The blood work was clean. The scans were normal. Jason double-checked the codes and notes. It was clear Liam had never shown any cancer cells. The entire diagnosis had been invented. Sarah felt sick just thinking about what that meant. They didn't stop there. Jason continued digging through the files over the next few days, moving carefully so no one would notice. He discovered that the doctors responsible for Liam's case all had connections to a company called RCI Medical. At first, the name didn't mean anything to Sarah. But when Jason explained that RCI Medical was owned by Elintech, everything started to make sense. The same company that Richard Ellington controlled was behind the entire treatment process. But this wasn't real medicine. RCI Medical was promoting experimental transplants for billionaires, risky procedures with no guarantee of success and extremely high costs. The goal wasn't to cure anyone. It was to sell hope at a massive price. Jason found financial records showing that Richard had already paid millions to this subsidiary. Liam had become part of a plan designed not to heal, but to keep the money flowing. Sarah couldn't believe it. The sickness, the doctors, the procedures, it was all part of a well-organized scam. Jason uncovered something even worse. He found that the transplant, the one Richard believed would save his son, wasn't going to happen at all. There was no surgery scheduled in the foreign clinic. No real team was waiting. The entire operation was fake. Jason read internal memos and communication logs between staff at RCI Medical. These messages explained how they used certain medications to create symptoms in patients. These drugs caused fatigue, loss of appetite, and changes in blood test results, mimicking the signs of cancer. On top of that, medical reports were forged, signed by doctors who didn't exist or who had no knowledge of the case. Jason showed Sarah one message that talked about manipulating parents by using fear and stress. It was part of a system. They convinced wealthy families their children were terminally ill, controlled their emotions, and drained their money. Liam had been kept sick on purpose. Sarah was speechless. All this time, the boy hadn't been receiving treatment. He had been poisoned. Sarah and Jason knew they had to tell Richard the truth. No matter the risk, they couldn't stay silent. They prepared the documents, printed the most important pages, and planned their approach. One evening, they went to the hospital wing and asked to speak with Richard Ellington directly. They told the security guards it was urgent and involved Liam's treatment. At first, they were ignored, but after insisting, they were allowed into a waiting room. When Richard finally arrived, Jason began explaining what they had found. He showed Richard the documents and tried to guide him through the false reports, the fake signatures, and the proof that Liam had no cancer. Richard didn't say much. He listened with a cold expression, barely reacting. Minutes later, several men entered the room, hospital security. Without saying a word, they escorted Sarah and Jason out of the building. They were told never to return. It was clear Richard had made his choice. He didn't believe them, or he chose not to. After being kicked out of the hospital, Sarah and Jason turned to the press. They contacted every news outlet they could find, sending copies of the documents and a full summary of everything they had discovered. They wrote emails, made phone calls, and even tried to schedule in-person meetings. At first, there was interest. Some reporters replied, asking for more information, but then things went quiet. One by one, the journalists stopped responding. Jason called one of them directly, only to be told that the story had been blocked. Sarah asked why, but the reporter didn't give details. He just said it wasn't going to be published. Jason later found out that many of the media companies they contacted had sponsors or investors linked to Ellintech. That explained everything. No one wanted to risk their funding. No one wanted to face a legal battle with one of the most powerful companies in the country. Their voices were being silenced before they could even be heard. With nowhere else to go, Sarah and Jason sat in silence. They had done everything they could. They had the truth. They had the evidence. But no one would listen. The hospital had removed them, the media had shut them out, and Richard Ellington, the one person who could make a difference, had rejected the truth. Sarah felt defeated. All the risks, all the fear, all the work, they had led to nothing. Liam was still inside that hospital, still being kept sick by people pretending to help him. And now they were back where they started, with no way to protect him. Jason said they couldn't stop. They had to find another way, maybe reach someone outside the country or get legal help. But Sarah didn't know how much longer she could keep going. Everything around them was controlled, everything was being hidden, and the world saw them as nothing more than a paranoid cleaner and a young doctor with no power. Sarah had no plan, no permission, and no support. But after everything she and Jason had uncovered, she couldn't stay silent anymore. She found out that a private board meeting would be taking place inside the main building of Elentech. She knew Richard would be there. That morning, dressed in her regular clothes and holding a folder full of evidence, she entered the company building. Security tried to stop her, but she pushed past them. Inside the meeting room, executives were seated around a long table, and Richard was at the head. Everything stopped when she walked in. She raised her voice and placed a tablet on the table. Jason had helped her compile short video clips and voice recordings. They played out loud, conversations between staff, mentions of forged records and hidden treatments. At first, Richard was furious. He stood up, shouting, demanding security, but then his eyes landed on a document. He froze. The handwriting looked familiar, too familiar. He didn't say a word. Sarah didn't stop. She pointed to the document that made Richard pause. It had a signature and handwritten notes that were supposed to belong to a doctor still overseeing Liam's case, but Jason had already checked it. That doctor had died 2 years earlier. The handwriting on the document wasn't new. It belonged to Dr. Alan Forrester, Richard's late wife's trusted physician. Richard recognized it immediately. It was the doctor who had treated his wife before her death. Seeing that signature, supposedly dated just weeks ago, shook him. Jason stepped forward and explained that the hospital had reused the doctor's name to give the reports credibility. The signature was likely copied from an old medical file. The realization hit Richard hard. He sat down, confused and pale. The room was silent. Sarah said nothing more. She didn't need to. What they had just shown could no longer be denied. Richard looked around the room, then quietly ordered everyone to leave, except his legal advisor. Once the room cleared, Richard asked for every copy of the videos and documents Sarah and Jason had brought. He didn't speak much, but his voice was calmer. He asked one of his oldest lawyers to verify what they saw. He wanted no press, no board involvement, and no immediate statements. He gave orders to start a silent internal investigation. No one else could know what was happening. Not yet. Sarah and Jason were told to stay quiet and not share the files with anyone else for the time being. Richard promised to look into it deeply. Sarah didn't fully trust him, but she understood that he had just seen evidence with his own eyes. He was shaken, no longer angry. He finally understood this wasn't just an attack on his family, it was a lie built around his son's life. For the first time, someone on the inside was listening. Sarah and Jason left the building quietly, not knowing what would happen next, but knowing something had changed. Days passed with no news, Then things started happening quickly. First, the head surgeon responsible for Liam's case suddenly left the country. No one knew exactly when he disappeared. His phone went dead and his house was empty. Then, 3 nurses from the hospital also vanished. They stopped showing up to work and left no messages. Internal emails were deleted. Staff members started whispering. It was clear that the silent investigation was no longer silent. Richard had sent private investigators to confirm what Sarah and Jason had revealed. What they found matched the files: fake treatments, false billing, controlled communication, and forged doctor identities. Richard finally contacted the authorities. He didn't make a public statement, but he shared the findings with the police. An official investigation was opened. Officers began visiting the hospital. Computers were taken. Doctors were questioned. Some departments were shut down temporarily. People were nervous, but Sarah felt a small bit of justice. The truth was finally being looked at seriously. The media still remained quiet. No articles were published. No breaking news appeared. Elintech's influence over major outlets kept the case out of the spotlight. But inside the investigation, Sarah's role became important. She was asked to speak with detectives multiple times. Her copies of the documents, her personal notes, and even her memory of conversations became part of the official case. She was still restricted from going near the press, but the investigators now treated her like a key witness. Jason, too, was questioned. They both gave their full version of events. Everything matched. The timeline, the records, the behavior of the medical staff, it all made sense. Sarah no longer felt like just a cleaner being ignored. Her story mattered. It was strange to sit in a room with police officers and lawyers, telling them about months of silence and fear. But for once, someone wrote it all down. Her voice was finally part of something real, something that could not be erased. The final and most important change came when the hospital was forced to stop Liam's current treatment. A medical team not connected to Elintech was brought in to review the case. Sarah wasn't allowed to be near the room, but she heard what was happening. All of Liam's records were re-evaluated, new tests were ordered, the IVs were removed. The new doctors started their own reports from zero without using the old files. Richard agreed to all of it. He didn't speak much, but he followed every instruction from the authorities. He stayed near Liam, quiet and distant. He looked tired. Sarah wanted to believe he had finally understood. Jason said Liam would now be safe, that the drugs would stop, and the fake treatment would end. The boy would slowly return to normal health. Sarah hoped he was right. It wasn't over yet. There would be more questions, more trials, and more resistance. But for the first time, Liam's future no longer belonged to the people who had lied. The final medical tests were clear. After a full week of exams performed by independent doctors, the results proved what Sarah and Jason had suspected all along. Liam was healthy. There were no cancer cells, no sign of tumors, and no medical reason for him to have received any treatment at all. The doctors reviewed all the lab results, did physical evaluations, ran blood work and checked scans. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Liam had never been sick. The medications given to him were not for cancer. They were drugs used to weaken the body and create false symptoms. The fluids, the fatigue, the loss of appetite, it had all been caused by chemicals, not illness. The team filed an official report confirming that Liam had been misdiagnosed, or rather deliberately misled. This news shook everyone involved. Sarah had tears in her eyes when she heard the final confirmation. Jason just nodded, not surprised anymore. For the first time, Liam's real condition was known, and it changed everything. As the investigation continued, more shocking information came to light. Authorities uncovered a long trail of cases connected to RCI Medical. The company had been running the same scam for years. They targeted wealthy families, usually parents desperate to save their children from supposed terminal illnesses. Fake diagnoses were created with forged lab results and digital files. RCI then offered advanced treatments that didn't actually exist. Families paid billions in hopes of saving loved ones who were never sick to begin with. The treatments included controlled drug plans, constant hospital stays, and fake surgeries. It was all carefully planned and protected by layers of fake medical staff and paper trails. Several families came forward once the Liam case was made public. They shared similar stories of false hope and financial ruin. Some children had even died, not from disease, but from the drugs and stress placed on them. The scam had gone unnoticed for years because no one had dared to question it, until Sarah and Jason did. Richard Ellington broke down completely when the truth hit him. He stayed away from public view and avoided reporters. Those close to him said he was not the same man anymore. He had believed in the system without question. He trusted the doctors, the hospital, and the company he had helped build. And that blind trust had nearly destroyed his only child. Richard spent most days inside his office or next to Liam's bed, barely speaking to anyone. His lawyers released a short statement taking responsibility for the payments made to RCI Medical, but Richard himself remained silent. He blamed himself deeply. All his power and money had done nothing but put Liam in danger. The realization that he had paid for fake treatments, signed off on harmful medications, and ignored warning signs left him emotionally broken. He did not fight the investigation. He let it continue. And when the police asked for records, he handed over everything. For once, he stopped trying to control the outcome. RCI Medical was shut down immediately by health authorities. Their offices were sealed and their international operations were also frozen. Dozens of employees were questioned. Several top doctors were arrested, including those who had created and signed off on the fake documents used in Liam's case. The news of the arrest spread quickly. People were shocked that such a large operation had gone unnoticed for so long. Hospitals and clinics across the country began reviewing their records. Emergency medical panels were created to check other cases tied to RCI Medical. Government officials got involved. Investigations were launched to track down the money that had been paid for fake treatments. Some of the funds were recovered, while others were lost in offshore accounts. But the most important outcome was that the company could no longer hurt anyone else. Their scam was over. Thanks to Sarah's persistence and Jason's courage, a system built on lies was finally exposed and brought down for good. Sarah was officially cleared of all accusations. The charges related to data theft and professional misconduct were dropped completely. The police and investigators recognized her as the key person who had helped uncover the truth. Without her, Liam's condition would never have been questioned. She was given a formal letter of apology from the hospital and offered a position in a new department focused on patient advocacy. Sarah chose not to accept. She wanted a quieter life, but she was proud. Her name was cleared and her voice had finally been heard. Jason was also recognized. His name was cleared with the medical board and he was promoted within the hospital staff. He received support from fellow doctors who admired how he stood up for what was right. Both Sarah and Jason were invited to speak at medical conferences, though they kept a low profile. They didn't want fame. They just wanted the truth to be known. And now it was. Liam slowly began to recover. Now free from the harmful drugs and false treatments, his body started to regain strength. His skin color improved. His appetite returned. He laughed more and started to sleep better. Richard stayed close to him, trying to rebuild the connection they had lost. Doctors monitored Liam carefully, this time for real. They found no lasting damage, only weakness caused by months of unnecessary medication. Therapists were brought in to help him recover mentally too. He had been told he was dying. Now he had to learn how to live again. The story of his recovery made headlines. The case had gone from secret files to national news. Reporters followed every update, and the pressure forced the government to act. Emergency reforms were passed to prevent future medical fraud. Laws were changed to make hospital records more transparent and protect patients from corporate abuse. Liam's case became a symbol, and through it all, Sarah remained by his side, not as a nurse or cleaner, but as the person who saved his life. Richard Ellington had been avoiding public attention for weeks. Since the truth about the fraud came out, he had barely spoken in public or given any interviews. But deep inside, the guilt kept growing. One afternoon, without sending anyone ahead or scheduling anything, Richard went personally to see Sarah. He asked to speak with her alone. When they sat down, he didn't act like a businessman or a billionaire. He spoke like a father who had failed. Richard apologized. Not with empty words, but with real emotion. He thanked Sarah for not giving up, even when everyone treated her like she was crazy. He admitted that he had ignored too many signs and placed too much trust in a broken system. Then he offered her a financial settlement, millions of dollars, for everything she had been through. But he didn't stop there. Richard said he was starting a medical foundation in Liam's name to investigate hospital fraud, and he asked Sarah to be part of it, helping build something honest. Sarah listened carefully. She could see that Richard was sincere. She believed his apology, but she didn't want the money. She refused the settlement, saying that she hadn't done what she did for a reward. She only wanted the truth to come out and for Liam to be safe. But the idea of the foundation made sense to her. A place that would focus on preventing future scams, investigating suspicious medical practices, and protecting families. It felt meaningful. After thinking for a few days, Sarah agreed to join the foundation, but only in a role where she could be useful. Richard respected her decision and gave her full freedom to set the terms. She was no longer just a cleaning worker. Now she would help lead a real project that could change lives. Sarah asked that the foundation be completely independent from Ellen Tech. Richard agreed. From that moment they began working together, not as enemies, but as two people who had seen what corruption could do. During the weeks they spent reviewing reports, forming the foundation's goals, and organizing legal documents, Sarah and Jason began to grow closer. Their bond had already been strong, but now, without the constant fear and stress of the investigation, they finally had time to breathe. They started spending more time outside of work, simple things, coffee breaks, long talks, shared meals after long meetings. Jason admired Sarah's strength, her honesty, and her refusal to give up. Sarah trusted Jason completely. He had risked his future to support her when no one else believed her. What started as partnership slowly turned into friendship, and that friendship began to feel like something more. They didn't rush anything. Both were still processing everything they had gone through. But the connection between them was real. They supported each other not just professionally, but personally. They both understood what it meant to stand alone in the middle of a storm. Now, they were facing life after the storm, together, one step at a time. Meanwhile, Liam was finally beginning to experience the childhood he had been denied. With the harmful medications out of his system and proper support in place, his health improved quickly. He started attending a local school, one that offered special psychological assistance for children who had experienced medical trauma. At first, Liam was quiet and cautious, but over time, he opened up. He made new friends, joined classroom activities, and even started laughing again. Teachers said he was intelligent and kind. Therapists worked with him regularly, helping him understand what had happened and letting him ask questions at his own pace. Richard tried to be present in his son's life in a way he hadn't before. He attended school events and walked Liam to class when he could. They began to rebuild their relationship from scratch. For the first time in a long time, Liam was smiling for real, not because he was told to, but because he finally felt safe, loved, and free from everything that had held him back. The public reaction to the case was massive. Once the story broke through media barriers, it spread everywhere. News channels ran long reports explaining how the fraud worked and how many families had likely been affected. People were shocked. Parents across the country began checking their children's past medical records. Clinics that had worked with RCI Medical were placed under investigation. Medical associations demanded reform, and politicians were pressured to pass stricter laws. The scandal forced hospitals to review their protocols. It wasn't just about one case anymore. It had become a national issue. In the middle of all this, Sarah's name came up again and again. Articles described her as the woman who refused to stay silent, who risked everything to save a child that wasn't even her own. People sent her letters, messages, and invitations to speak. She didn't like the spotlight, but she understood why her story mattered. It gave others the strength to speak up too, and that made it all worth it. Sarah became a symbol of integrity and bravery. Civil and medical associations began recognizing her efforts. She received awards not for fame, but for what she stood for: truth, persistence, and justice. At events, people applauded her not because she was perfect, but because she had done what others wouldn't. She had seen something wrong and fought against it, even when the cost was high. Young women told her they felt inspired. Former patients thanked her for exposing the system. Doctors who had once looked down on her now respected her. But Sarah never let it change who she was. She kept her routine, stayed close to Jason and Liam, and continued her work at the foundation. Her goal was never praise. She only wanted to make sure this never happened again, to Liam or to anyone else. And while life would never return to how it was before, Sarah had finally found peace in knowing she had done the right thing, no matter how hard it was. The trial of the RCI medical leaders became one of the most followed legal cases in the country. Courtrooms were packed, news cameras stayed outside day after day, and people everywhere wanted justice. After months of investigations, testimonies, and evidence reviews, the truth was undeniable. Executives, doctors, and coordinators directly involved in the fraudulent operations were found guilty. The court showed how they had manipulated diagnoses, forged medical reports, and accepted massive payments in exchange for treatments that never existed. The judge called it one of the worst abuses of medical trust in American history. Some of the guilty were sentenced to over 30 years in prison. Others received smaller sentences, but all faced consequences. The verdict sent a message across the country. Those who use power and knowledge to harm others would no longer go unpunished. Families who had suffered in silence began speaking out. The courtroom became a symbol, not just of punishment, but of a system finally being held accountable for its failures. The case became a landmark moment in private healthcare history. Medical schools began updating their ethics programs. Hospitals changed their protocols for approving experimental treatments. Laws were passed to make diagnostic processes more transparent and to protect patients from being misled. News stations covered the case for weeks, explaining how so many people had been fooled and how long it had taken for the truth to come out. But alongside the reports about the crimes, there were also stories about the people who had made a difference. One of them was Sarah Monroe. In a special ceremony at the state capitol, she was awarded the Medal of Civic Honor by the Governor of Washington. She stood in front of a quiet crowd, humbled as her name was read aloud. She had started as a cleaner, unnoticed, often ignored, but her actions had helped expose a nationwide scandal. The award recognized not just her bravery, but her refusal to stay silent when it mattered most. Jason also saw his life change. After everything that happened, he was officially named clinical director of the new Ellington Foundation, the organization created to fight medical fraud. His promotion wasn't just a reward, it was recognition for the role he had played when he risked everything to support Sarah and protect Liam. Jason now led medical teams that investigated hospital complaints, reviewed cases flagged for inconsistencies, and trained younger doctors to recognize warning signs of unethical behavior. He worked long hours but felt proud of his role. Sarah was often by his side, helping guide the foundation's programs and building connections with families who needed support. Together, they made sure the foundation stayed honest, focused, and never lost sight of why it was created. Richard Ellington remained in the background, watching the work grow from a distance. He had donated half of his personal wealth to the foundation and other medical oversight initiatives. Though rarely seen, his actions continued to fund investigations that helped protect patients across the country. Richard's life became very private. After the public trial and the collapse of RCI Medical, he decided to disappear from the spotlight. He gave no more interviews and declined any public appearances. He moved to a quiet property far from Seattle, living with a small staff and focusing only on his son and the foundation's progress. The donations he made were large and ongoing. Some went to legal support for medical whistleblowers. Others supported families still recovering from false treatments. But more than the money, Richard gave space for change. He no longer tried to lead or control everything. He listened to Sarah and Jason, respected their decisions, and allowed the foundation to grow beyond his name. For Liam, Richard remained a father who had made terrible mistakes but was trying to make them right. Their relationship slowly healed over time. Richard never asked for forgiveness publicly, but through his silence and support, he made it clear that he would never again allow trust to be misplaced without proof. Liam, now a teenager, continued growing in a healthy and happy environment. He knew what had happened in his early years, but only understood the full story as he got older. Through school programs and personal therapy, he learned how lies had shaped his childhood and how truth had set him free. But more than anyone, he credited Sarah for never giving up. He often called her his second mother. They had a close bond that had only strengthened over time. Jason became a steady part of his life too, not just as a doctor, but as family. Together, the three of them created a peaceful, supportive space that helped Liam thrive. He played sports, made friends, and started thinking about his future, maybe medicine, maybe law. His past didn't define him anymore. It taught him to ask questions, to be careful, and to trust people who earned it. The trauma had left marks, but so had the people who loved him enough to fight back and protect him. Years later, Sarah and Jason married in a quiet ceremony, attended by only close friends and family. There were no photographers, no media, and no speeches. Just a small group of people who had lived through the darkest parts of the story and were now here to witness a brighter chapter. After the wedding, Sarah and Jason founded a new organization, one focused on helping people inside the healthcare system speak out. The goal was simple: protect whistleblowers, guide them legally, and make sure they had support when standing against corruption. The organization offered hotlines, legal counseling, and partnerships with hospitals ready to reform. It became a safe place for those who feared retaliation for telling the truth. The Ellington case had started as a tragedy, but ended with justice, healing, and real change. Lives had been saved. The system had been challenged, and Sarah had proven that the truth, even when buried and ignored, could still win. Even in the darkest corners, someone had chosen to fight, and that had made all the difference. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.